of Unity School. I'd like you all to give a warm welcome to Unity's national treasure, James Dillet Freeman.
I didn't really want to come up here, folks, but they told me I had to. So it's fine. I'm not much at separating the speaker from the people he's speaking to. No, they have a reason for having me up here. They're taking a picture. And I don't care. But it's easier to speak. Now I'm speaking down. But that doesn't make any difference because I'm never sure what I'm going to do anyway. And they have made a lot of videos of me. And I hate to tell the people who have made them. They give them to me. I've never looked at one of them. Hey, I'd make a lot better speech if I did. I could see the things I shouldn't do. Am I supposed to be speaking into this too? Am I? I'm speaking. Good. The thing is, I really didn't know what I was going to do and wasn't very sure about what you all were, because I didn't really know what I was going to do until I saw this. They sent it to me. The Heart of Unity is Joy. That's a great title, isn't it? And then they gave me the title, Joy is the Poetry of Life. And it really doesn't make any difference whether they told me what I was going to speak about or not. Oh, okay. I'm glad there are people to do this. But as far as what I'm going to speak about, I'm a lot like the little girl who went to the dancing school. And she was having a great time, just as you people were there a few minutes ago, dancing around there, you know, and just having a wonderful time. And finally, the poor dancing instructor could stand it no longer. So I went out and tapped her gently on the shoulder and said, "Honey, don't you hear the music?" She said, "Sure, I hear it, but it don't bother me none." And that's the way I feel about subjects that people give me to speak about. Or even if I give them. I don't like titles. I've always detested them. If you people read my poetry in Daily Word, I've never titled one of them. The editor titles them. And I'm happy for her to title them because it gives the editor something to do. Well, if you don't give editors something to do, folks, they find things to do. They rewrite your stuff. And I want them to keep their hands off my stuff as much as I can. I'm happy to get criticism, but I don't want too much of it. And I like to have the last word on anything I write because I feel I can write it as well as the editor can. And it's my writing, and I ought to have a right to do it, just as you write your play and do that. I enjoyed this. Didn't you all enjoy it? Yeah, right. It was fun. And they were having fun doing it. And really, I feel like, after I watched them, they should have done this made them about 4 times longer. And then, because really, I'm just kind of an encore to this. You're the show, folks, when they're doing this. And they wanted you to be the show. And they tried to get you to be the show, to sing and to clap your hands and to do all the other things that they were having you do. And that's the way it ought to be. I have a feeling back there in Jesus' time, when he went out like that an awful lot of people took part in it. He just didn't stand up there and give them a metaphysical lecture. We like to do that in Unity too much. And we're never going to win the world, folks, unless we do a little bit more of what happened here tonight. Because, well, I love that too. I love the fact that in Unity talk, and I especially love when they have me. The horrible part is when you go to a good service, if it's a good service, they've got a good singer up there. And people will always applaud the good singer because we're moved by song. And if a really good singer sings it, then we're moved. And people will even give a singer many times a standing ovation. And they don't do that to preachers very often, folks. In fact, they don't even give them a sitting ovation. And I love that. That's what it has to be. You're not going to win the world on just an intellectual discourse. It is impossible. There is a religion that has tried to do that, and it has been very successful insofar as it can be. It's called Unitarianism. And they win the world by social work and by intellectual discourses. They get into everything. They're going to win it by social reform. And they have had some of the best people in America as members, but they've never had very many. And if we're going to win the world, and I think we ought to, I'm a believer in unity. I think we're going to be one of the great religions of the future and win millions of people, because it has to change. Jesus was not what they've made him, and neither was God, folks. Oh, you know what they've made him into. This stern judge off there somewhere who's going to send us all to hell. That's what they believe, and that's what they've taught for 2,000 years. I'm trying to write a book. I haven't really started it yet, but I've asked a couple girls to help me. There they are. Huh? And I'm going to ask you to start this week. We're going to write that book because I've been writing another book. That's what's kept me. I've written a lot of love poetry, folks. I just lost my wife a few months ago, and during all the 40 years I was married to her, I wrote her love poetry. She loved it. I would bring it to her on Valentine's Day and on her birthday and on our wedding anniversary and the like. And she expected me to come in with that love poetry, but I never did anything about it. Just gave it to her. And then I had a wife before I had Billy, and she died back in 1948, as a matter of fact. And we were married about 14 years. And when she died, it was I was a pretty young person, and so was she. And it was a terrible, terrible experience. And the only way I could meet it, I'm a writer, you see. I wrote a whole series of poems about her death. They're not happy poems. They're very sad. They're me struggling and her struggling to meet life. But I had all those poems, and I've sent them off to some people in California, and they're going to publish them if I can get them all in some kind of order. And I've written a lot of articles, if maybe you've read some of them in Unity, about Billy and my meeting this thing with her. And they're going to make this into a book. It's not a Unity book. It's a book of love poems. And that's what I've been doing. Why I haven't been doing this other book that I want to write a book about the Bible and about Jesus and what I think he came to teach us, because I think they've been teaching us a lot of bunk as to what he was teaching us. Partly because they didn't know. They weren't ready for Jesus. All they knew was the Old Testament. And the God in the Old Testament, folks, is not a happy fellow. I mean, he is gloomy. He's not only gloomy, he's cruel. And Jesus never taught that kind of a God. And then they even made Jesus into that sort of a God. The only real reason they have Jesus is he's hanging up there on the cross. And then he's going on into the next world. He's nothing in this world because nobody tries to live the way he told them to live. Not really. It's too hard. He's going on there, and then he's going to be the judge in heaven. You know, this guy said, don't judge anybody. You're going to be judged by your judgments. And what did they do to him? They made him the judge who's going to decide how many of you are going to heaven, what few, and how all the rest of you are going to hell. This poor guy who loved everybody. It's unbelievable what they've done. And I think I can write a book that says, hey, that isn't what it was meant. I've come to love him. And that took a long time for me. because I was never sure he existed. And maybe he didn't. But what he stands for exists, no matter what, whether it's true or not true. And I'll tell you, I've been reading a lot of books, because you got to read a lot of books. If you're going to write something like this, you got to know what you're writing about. And I'm a pretty good researcher into those things. And one of the things I liked about your show, they had some women up here as his disciples. Because, you know, part of the reason they had those, because that first-year class is mainly women. They didn't dare leave them out. The girls wouldn't have stood for that. But, you know, hundreds and hundreds of books were written about Jesus. We don't know how many. We found some just in the last, 30 or 40 years. The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi texts. And I think they've found over 100 such books. And of course, they tell a very different story about some of the details. And many of those books have women disciples. But the people who decided, they didn't write the Bible, but a bunch of priests in about the 3rd centuries decided what books are going to be in the Bible out of all these hundreds that have been written. And these men were priests in the pure sense of the priest, you know, monks. And women were not highly regarded by them. In fact, they fled from them. I remember one saint, I don't remember which, he said, when temptation came to him, it always came in such a beautiful form that there was nothing left for him to do but wrap his cloak tightly around him and flee into the desert. And I sort of know how he felt. But I haven't fled into the desert, folks. I think Jesus came teaching just what this show is about. Be joyous. God is a God of joy. I believe that. Sorrow, a sad God couldn't have made life. Not this unbelievable exuberance of things. It had to be something that was just rejoicing in itself to pour out all you people and all the 100,000s of forms that the world has been full of, and new ones all the time. Sadness could never have done it. It just couldn't. Sadness is deep down and slow and not does much. It just sits around and is depressed. What you got to do is watch a little depression. They don't do anything. That's it. They lose all their power to live. And depression, too. Because they gave me this subject about joy, I was looking up some stuff about joy. If you're unhappy, folks, you've learned to be unhappy. That's all. They've conducted some experiments, some college things. It's some man, I've forgotten his name, but he is a real, I guess you'd call him a doctor of depression. A lot of doctors are depressing. But this guy looks into why you are depressed. And he came up with a test. They have you look into, through 2 eyepieces, at a picture they throw on the screen. And then they give it to you, flick, flick, like that. And then you have to say what you've seen in that second. And some people see very sad couple there, or a mushroom cloud, you know, exploding, or something of that. Other people who look at the same pictures see flowers, and beautiful flowers, or happy people smiling. And why? What is really there? Both are there. They throw 2 pictures, one on one eye and one on the other, flick, flick. And the one you say is there is the one that shows how you feel about life. If you say it's a sad thing, it's because you see sad things in life. And if you say it's a happy thing, it's because you see happy pictures in life. It's up to you. They've proved that over and over again, that that's what you'll see. Some students see them both who take those tests. And I suppose they're fairly balanced. I don't know how I'd do with a test like that. I hope I would see a lot of joy. I think I'm a pretty happy person. I try to be. And I believe in being happy, even if I'm not. I can be gloomy. And friends, I think, would tell me, well, Jim, you're moody. You can get down and then you can get up. But I know I'm meant to be happy. What's the point of being sad? I could sit around and suffer And people who write me letters now, my wife died 3 months ago. They write me letters, and in the letters I can see they think, oh, we know, Jim, how you're sitting there mourning, you know. And we're praying for you, and we're lifting you up. Folks, I am lifted up. I'm not mourning. I have mourned for my wife, but unfortunately, my wife was sick for 10 years. And I did mourn when she first got sick. I mourned, I cursed, I cried, I did everything. But now, I haven't got that much time to sit around and mourn. I don't know how much time I've got, but I don't have enough to sit around and mourn very long. And I'm not going to do it. And thank God I'm a worker, because what I'm doing is writing books, you see, and writing anything else, and the poems they asked me to write. A lot of poetry, you know, when they gave me that title, what is it? The poetry of life is joy. Joy is the poetry of life. A lot of poetry is not joyous, folks. It's gloomy. There's a lot more gloomy poetry than happy poetry in the world. A lot more. 15 years ago, I had to go to a hospital for an operation. And I decided, since I knew I'd be there at least a week before they let me out, that I'd take some books with me. So I chose two. I chose an anthology of poetry, and I chose a joke book. And my wife went with me, and then on the very first night, when she came back that evening, I said, honey, take this poetry book back with you, would you please? If I read these poems, I'll never get out of this hospital. I'll be dead in a week. They're so gloomy. Poets are an unbelievably gloomy lot, for the most part. They sit around and write about all the things that are wrong. And they usually can write it pretty well, so they make it very vivid to you. I kept the joke book, and I read from it every day. And one night, I'm an early riser, very early, and in the hospital you might as well be because they wake you up anyway. But I'd wake up and I'd read my joke book. And one time I was reading some pretty good jokes, and I was laughing and laughing, and suddenly a nurse ran into the room. And she said, what's the matter? What's the matter? And I said, well, nothing. I'm just laughing. I was reading my books. She said, laughing? You're not supposed to laugh in a hospital. I thought you were groaning. But I was glad I kept that joke book. And I've always before, for years I was here. As he said, I came here in 1929. But for years I was here, and I wouldn't speak for Unity. I spoke for them a couple times, and then I wouldn't. I talked. And I was very happy just to be here and teach. And I wouldn't go out and speak. But finally they talked me into going out and speaking. And when I did, the very first thing I did, I went downtown in Kansas City to a secondhand bookstore, and I bought 2 joke books and took them home with me, because I knew that's what I was going to need if I was going out and speak for Unity. I didn't go buy the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, folks. Ed Rabel bought that. But maybe sometimes people who have listened to me are thinking, we wish he'd gone and bought a Metaphysical Bible Dictionary. But it just isn't in me, folks. I like humor. I love it. I used to think for many years that humor and human had to come from the same etymological source. But I looked them up in the dictionary one time. You know, the etymology of a word, the root, is in brackets in Webster's. And I discovered that they did not come from the same source. I don't even remember what they are. Humor comes from humus. That's right. Those are the humus. The medieval people thought that these were humors. You had humors in you. Flowings in the blood of a certain kind. You were of a certain humor. And human comes from homo, meaning man. And they weren't alike at all. And you know all that proved to me? How wrong dictionaries can be. Because if there are 2 things that belong together in this world, folks, it's humor and human. We're the only people, the only species that laughs. Oh, hyenas do, they say, but that isn't a laugh, you know. We can laugh. Without it, we wouldn't be here. We need it so much to be able to laugh and to laugh at ourselves. And it is the very essence, almost, of being human, to have this wonderful ability to just laugh and to get up here and play around on the stage and have a good time. And you laughed watching them, didn't you? Wasn't it fun? Sure. I did. I really do. I felt a little like an encore. I brought some, since they said poetry, I thought I have to read some things, but I didn't know what to read. I haven't written, well, I have. I've written joyous poems. Have any of you, since he told about my coming here in 1929, how many have ever heard about the first poem I ever read at Silent Unity? None of you? Oh, well, I think you'll like it. See, I came to Silent Unity, to work in 1929 because the Fillmores had a Wednesday evening healing service. And they loved to have entertainment. They would have loved to have had this beautiful singer who sang that beautiful song, and the others who sang and who you sang and played. Oh, gosh, they'd have loved to have had you people. Or somebody who could play an instrument. But they didn't like to pay much for their entertainment, partly because they didn't have much. So every once in a while, Myrtle Fillmore would call me. I lived just across the street from Unity, and say, James, would you come over to our healing meeting and read one of your poems to us? And of course, you don't ask a poet to read poems without expecting to get them. So I'd go over and read one of my nice Unity poems that I'd written. Well, anyway, when she went to May Rowland, finally, one summer, and said, May, I have a young poet, and I want you to put him to work in Silent Unity. And May told me afterwards, she said, Jim, if there was anything we didn't need in Silent Unity, it was a young poet. She said, we didn't even need an old poet. But of course, when the boss comes and tells you to put somebody to work, you do. They gave me a job addressing envelopes, which would have been all right, except I really didn't know how to type. And I had to type addresses. They probably never had so many misaddressed envelopes in the whole history of Silent Unity. But I'd only been there for a week or two when somebody came to me. It was probably May. May Rowland was the director of Silent Unity for 50 years, folks. Wonderful person, really a wonderful person. A true leader, a spiritual leader. Anyway, she came and said, James, we would like you to read a poem to Silent Unity. But what they didn't know was, in school that year, I had to memorize a very long poem. And I had not had an audience on whom I could read it. So that was all boiling up in me. And here I had a nice audience of 100 people all sitting in front of me. And I thought, memorizing that poem is not going to go to waste this time. Here it is. But unfortunately, it wasn't exactly a Unity poem. It was one of the cantos from Hiawatha by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And not only that, the canto that it was The Death of Minnehaha. It isn't a very Unity poem, folks. It starts out, oh, the long and dreary winter. Oh, the cold and cruel winter. Oh, the fever and the famine. Oh, the blasting of the fever. Oh, the wasting of the famine. Oh, the wailing of the children. Oh, the anguish of the women. Folks, that's the happiest part of the whole poem. But I got up there before that poor Silent Unity audience. They didn't know what they were going to receive. And for 200 or 300 lines, I don't know how long it is, I slowly murdered Minnehaha. I had her lying cold and dead at my feet. And when I finished, there was a strange hush that hung over Silent Unity. And there was a lady whom I got to know very well. She was one of the teachers, and she was sitting right where you were sitting there in the front row, that audience over there. That Fillmore Chapel, you know, has that center aisle. But suddenly this woman was not sitting there. She had risen about 5 feet into the air with her arms outstretched like this. And she exclaimed, life, life, we will now affirm life. I sneaked out behind the curtain. And there was another boy there, and he said, "You sure didn't last long in silent unity." But I fooled him and myself, because when I came to this place, I had no intention of staying here. It was just a summer job. And then when I finished college, they came and offered me a job. That time Cora came. Myrtle was dead by then. And she offered me a job. And so I came back to work because it was the bottom of the Depression, folks, and there were no jobs. So I took it and expected only to stay here till I could get a job somewhere else. But I stayed. Partly I stayed because the first day I came to work then, a girl came up to me and said, "You know, a bunch of the fellows and a bunch of the girls are going out to Unity Farm, and they have rented 2 cabins in the picnic grounds. And I know the boys would like to have you if you would go with them, because they need all the fellows they can get. And I have a car, and I'd be happy to take you." So I said, "Oh, I'd be happy to go." And I stayed, because a year later I married her, my first wife. And probably that's what kept me in Unity. Also, the wonderful people that I met. Wonderful people worked in Silent Unity, folks. I assume they still work there. Really lovely, gentle, kind people trying to live this life the way they feel spiritual people ought to live it. They don't always make it. They have all sorts of failures. All of us do. But the thing I felt about all of them was, here are people trying to live a life that's a good life, that's a loving, kind life, considerate of other human beings, and really sincerely praying for those people, really putting their heart and soul into the work that they're doing. And that's what really kept me in this place, was the people. And I guess that's all there is anyway, people. What else is there but people? We have all these fancy ideas, but they aren't really important. It's only how are you working them out in your own life. Well, this isn't the speech I started to make, and I've got a lot of things. I've started to read a poem. How long have I spoken already? I didn't pay attention. This was one of the poems I started to read when I was thinking. See, when I came here, too, when I was a little boy, after that one bit with Minnie Ha-Ha, I realized that wasn't the way to go, folks. So when I got up in front of an audience, I was very serious. And I had a serious metaphysical lecture to deliver when they asked me, and I delivered it in a very serious way. And finally, May Rowland came up to me one day, and she said, "Jim, don't you like us?" I said, "Why, of course I like you." She said, "Well, why don't you look like it then?" She said, "When you speak to us, you frown." And I said, "Well, I have a very serious talk that I'm making." She said, "Well, we would like it if you'd look like you like us." And I thought, oh, gosh, I don't want to look like I don't like those people. It changed my life, really, to some extent anyway, because I began to smile. And you know how I learned to smile when I got up in front of people? I looked around the audience until I found a smiler. He's smiling at me, you see. And when you see someone smile at you, you almost have to smile back. And I would look for smilers, and then I'd smile. And so I got to learn how to make a speech and smile at people, even if I was saying something deadly serious. I can still smile, and I can especially smile if someone's smiling with me. And I've always been able to do that. I don't fake smiles. And I've learned to smile enough that people like, you know, I have a column called Life is a Wonder, and several times in the course of the 30 years I've written it, they put a picture in, but occasionally they leave it out. When they do, the editor always gets complaints. They said, cut down on what he has to say and put his picture back in there. Because he's smiling. People love smiles. You want to have lots of friends? You know, you've heard that old thing about be a friend is the way to have a friend. There's a better way. Be a cheerful person. Be a smiler. There have been all kinds of studies made of college students especially, and all of them show that the thing people like best in other people is cheerfulness. Stop and think what you like. You like people to make you happy, don't you? And cheerful people make you happy. They come into a room and they bring cheer and joy in with them. And you like that. They say misery loves company. That's an old statement. But happiness multiplies happiness. And it just does. And we love it. So if you really want people to like you, learn to smile and learn to be of good cheer. And they're going to like you. So I've smiled. I've had people tell me, too, I don't like this too much, but they've said, 5 years ago you came to our center and you made a speech. And I don't remember anything you said, but I remember your smile. I think, well, I wish they'd remember something I said. Because I think I usually say something. I think I say things that are important. They're important to me. And when I write things that are important. I try not to be heavy. And if I write that book about Jesus and God and love, I hope I can write it with great intensity. I hope I can write it. I think I'm a great writer. I write beautifully. I write with great feeling. And I think I convey feeling to other people. And if I can't do that with that book, it'll be a flop. What I don't want it to be is just another theological treatise. Because nobody reads theological treatises except other theologians. And I don't want that. I think it's time people began to say, hey, this man came to teach us. God is love. And we're meant to love one another. And if we do, it'll be a great life for us. Don't you think that's what he came to say? Unity's close to it, folks. It isn't there. Because it's got to get out of this intellect thing. And down here, in our gut. Because that's where we live. In the center of our being. It's interesting. And even Charles Fillmore put that solar plexus dealie down there. That was our center when he thought up all those 12 powers, The interesting thing about him, too, he loved the idea of joy. Charles was a man with a great sense of humor. And I never heard him make a speech in his life when he didn't have a joke in it, or two. But he thought up those 12 powers, and I've always thought, why in the world didn't he make one of them joy? What's wrong with religion? It doesn't want joy in religion, you see. It wants it gloomy. It feels somehow if it's happy, it's not profound. And it wants to be deep. So it's got to be gloomy and sad. And that's what Christianity became. For 2,000 years it's been gloomy and sad. And taught that this is a veil of tears, folks, and nothing in it is of any value. You're not really meant to enjoy anything. You're supposed to go off and go barefoot into the desert, wrap yourself in sackcloth and the like, and fast, and do everything to deny. I don't believe that. I think we're meant to affirm life and to live it to the full. That doesn't mean to hurt other people. You can't live it to the full if you're going around hurting people. And Jesus, that's what I think he taught. He said, love one another. And if you do it, God will give you anything you ask him to give you. That's his whole teaching as far as I can see. Because he's love. My Father is love. He says it over and over again. And if you will love, if you'll have faith in him, and how do you have faith in him? If you will love. And who do you love? Who you got to love? But one another. Loving some abstract principle isn't going to get you there. I've got to love you. That's hard. It's easy for me to love an abstract principle. It's hard for me to love you. Some of you, probably very hard. I like those who look happy. I'm loving them better right now because I'm trying to make you look happy. And if you're looking gloomy, I'm not loving you as much as I'd like to. It ain't easy. He didn't say it was easy. But he said if you'll do it, you're going to have a life like nothing you can even dream of. It will be heaven on earth. And stop and think. Won't it? If we loved one another, Wouldn't it be heaven on earth? When is the happiest time of your life, folks? Think about the happy times of your life or unhappy ones. Haven't they been moments of love? The most wonderful moments you've had in your whole life. And just think if you could live like that all the time. Wouldn't it be great? It would be heaven. That's what heaven is. Heaven is love. Oh, I believe this. And I'm going to try to write about it. Pray for me. Well, let me say a few... let me read something here. I brought some things. And I haven't used any of them. Yeah. I should have at least a couple jokes. Here are a couple jokes. Some young people who probably have caught my spirit. I don't know who they are. I don't know the men at all. But they sent me a big book. Oh, it's this big, you see. And it's 100 pages, several hundred. And they called it God's Joke Book. And I think all the stuff in it is copyrighted and the like. And they didn't copyright any of it, I'm sure. And they simply took everything. They took funny strips, articles about psychology, about religion, about sociology, anything like that that was funny. And they put it in this book. And they sent me a copy, feeling I'd like it. I don't know who they are, but they signed their names, but I've forgotten them. They probably wanted people to forget them, because all this stuff is copyrighted. This is a funny little cartoon that shows a businessman. He's all dressed up the way I am. You people are dressed the way you should be, and the way I wish I was. I figure women put these on us, folks. That's because they'd have something to lead us about by. Anyway, it shows this businessman. He's got his attaché case and he's walking down the street, Suddenly a voice comes out of the sky. Malcolm J. Farley. And you can see him starting to shake. This is the Lord speaking. Whew. Have a good day. If God's going to speak, isn't that what you'd like to hear him say? I heard God speak once. I didn't bring that poem. I should have. That would have been a good ending for this. But when my wife was dying, my first wife, I went alone into the healing room on a Saturday morning, and I prayed, and I was desperate. And as I prayed, I heard a voice. I'm always listening for an inner voice, but that morning I heard a voice as loud as mine is now. And it said, "Do you need me? I am there." And then that all came to me. I didn't think of it as a piece of writing, but I had an envelope in my pocket, took it out and wrote the words down. And of all the things I've written, it has meant the most to the most people. And so God did speak to me once. At least I thought he was speaking. And I didn't think of it as something to publish. It was months before I gave it to the editor of Daily Word, and she said, "Let's print it, Jim." Well, here's another cartoon. This is Frank and Ernest. We don't have this funny in the Kansas City paper. Do you have it, any of you? Yes. Frank and some of it. Shows these two men with bowler hats climbing up the mountain. And on top of it is a man who is a guru, you see, because he's got real long hair like mine. But he's barefoot and it looks like a robe of some sort. And also I know he's a guru because they open this little strip by saying, "Hey, guru." "Hey, guru, I've always wondered, what do you guys do up here on the mountain all day?" "Well, at sunrise, I get up, eat a handful of parched corn, and start meditating. And then, at noon, I eat another handful of parched corn and go back to meditating till dark, when I stop and eat a little more parched corn." Fantastic! What do you meditate about? Chocolate-covered raisins, French fries, hot dogs, banana splits, donuts, baked Alaska, and Twinkies. That's the kind of guru I like. Well, one of my favorite stories in the Bible, see, this is the stuff I brought to give you instead of the talk I gave you. And this story is in 2 Samuel And it tells how David brought the Ark of the Lord back to Jerusalem. They had it hidden out there because they didn't want the raiders of the lost Ark in 3000 BC to get it. And it was the Ark, folks, because one poor guy that David brought along with him, he thought the cart was tipping a little, and he reached out and touched the Ark, and zingo, it got him, just like it did in Raiders of the Lost Ark. So it was it. But it's a great story. It's in 2 Samuel in the 6th chapter, and you ought to go read it, because it made me think of you people. With your dancing around, and you're beating where the tambourines, and you had something in your hand, somebody or you, yeah? You had all those instruments, and they had the guitars and all that, because it said, they carried the Ark of God upon a new cart, and David and all the house of Israel were making merry before the Lord with all their might. They weren't holding back and being solemn. Here's the Ark of the Lord, folks, the most sacred object in the whole universe. And what are they doing? They're making merry in front of it with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And David casts off his garment until he's clad only in an ephod. An ephod's practically a little loincloth that the priests wore. He's naked. And he danced before the Lord with all his might, playing all those instruments all around him. And he came clear back to Jerusalem, dancing and naked before the Lord. And I thought, I love it. I wouldn't do it, but I love it. Somehow I feel it's right that that's what God would want. He wouldn't want people going with their long suits and their long faces and holding candles and intoning very dull chants. No, he'd want them out there playing all those crazy instruments and singing and dancing, because he's joy, and his will for us is joy. Charles Fillmore said, when joy is put back into religion, there will be more religion in the world. And I believe that. And Unity tries to put it back. And if it ever asks me to get up and make a speech, I'm going to put some back, folks. I'm not going to make a dull speech, I hope. At least it won't be an unhappy one. It may be dull, but it's not going to be unhappy. Well, as I say, I still haven't read you any poetry. Here's a piece. This isn't exactly poetry, but it's poetic. I say, God thought, and his thoughts were light. God spoke, and his words were law. God lifted his hand, and the motion of his hand was power. God felt in his heart, and the feeling in his heart was love. God laughed, and his laughter was joy, and his joy became the infinite variety of shapes that are his world. Earth and stars and flowers and creatures and men and women and children. All the myriad things we know of, and all the myriad things we don't know of. And the laughter of God goes on and on. For God is the everlasting joy of being, rejoicing in its own becoming more, delighting in its own spontaneity. And wherever the laughter of God sounds, there the forms of life appear and reappear and give birth to yet more forms. And that's my vision of him. Well, that isn't the way I'm going to end it, because I say I brought some stuff and I'm going to end it the way I intended to end it. Unity's a happy religion. Let's see where I find how I was going to end it. It's here somewhere. No, it's unimportant. All I remember is I was making a talk in the chapel over there on a Sunday. And it was a talk kind of like this. They'd asked me to make a talk about joy, and so I brought a lot of jokes. And I read all those jokes, a lot more than I've read to you people. And everybody was laughing, just as you laughed tonight. Lots of laughter. And suddenly, as I got to the end of it, I realized, hey, this is on the radio. And all those Lutherans and Episcopalians who have been listening have thought it's just what we thought. It's a crazy cult. Listen to them laugh in church instead of sitting around intoning. And I thought, oh gosh, I shouldn't have done this. If I should have remembered, we would be on the radio. But when I got home, a girl called me who had been a dear friend of mine most of my life. And she said, oh, Jim, you don't know how good your talk was. She said, Stu, her husband's name was Stuart. She said, Stu laughed. He sat there and listened to you, and he laughed and laughed. And she said, it's the first time I've heard him laugh in months. And a few months later, I buried Stu. He was dying. And I thought afterward, you know, if I never made that talk for anybody else, I'm glad I made it for him. And since then, the wife of another very good friend of mine died. Her name was Martha Smock, who was the editor of Daily Word for years. And then her husband and Georgie, who had been Stu's, I buried Stu, and then I buried Martha, and then I married Carl Smock and Georgie. So it had a happy ending, and they're still married, and that's great. But I'm so glad I made that funny speech that it made him laugh who was having a hard time laughing. Maybe it's the best speech I ever made, just for that reason. Because everybody prays that there'll be somebody who needs to hear what you have to say. Otherwise, what's the point of my getting up here? I hope I've given you some ideas. And I'm going to end it by reading you a poem. And the poem is, And Not a Sound Was Heard. I'll read it because I like this poem. The editor titled it. I don't know what I would have titled it. But I was out by Pikes Peak, and I was looking out the window of the hotel I was in, not far from the mountain, and suddenly I thought, that mountain's laughing at me. And why is it laughing at me? And I wrote a poem called, she called it, And Not a Sound Was Heard. And it's been a funny poem, because it's a fun poem, in a way. But right after I wrote it, after it was in Daily Word, a woman wrote to me from Texas, and she said, a friend, no, not a friend, I guess it was somebody came into the church, maybe it was a center leader. She said, came into my church and told me that she had just come from the doctor's office, and the doctor had told her that her husband had an inoperable brain tumor, and there was no hope. And she had 2 little children that she was going to have to figure out a way to support. And she said, I didn't know what to say to her. But Daily Word was on my desk with your poem on the back, and I put it in her hand. And now she writes to me, and she sent me the scribbled letter that the woman had written. And then she had quoted 2 lines out of my poem. And I've often thought, I don't know what I would have said to that woman if she'd come in and told me that her husband was dying and she had no hope. But I know I wouldn't have given her that poem about a laughing mountain. And one time I was speaking to people in a college, and then I was reading poetry in an English class in the college afterward, and a young man came running into the room. And he said, you wrote a poem about a laughing mountain. Did you bring it? And I said, yeah. He said, read it. So I read it. He was the dean of men in the college, and the woman told me that they'd had a riot the night before, and he had been in it, and she knew he had just come from a kind of a community service, a talk with the president of the college, and that he wasn't very happy. But he wanted to hear my laughing mountain. And a teacher wrote to me from Alaska that she had Eskimo students and Indian students. And when they got uproarious in class, she would have one of them get up and read my poem about a laughing mountain. And it quieted them down. So I've always thought this poem has something in it that maybe says something I want to say. So it's a good way to end it. I sat and looked at the mountain, and I laughed. I laughed, not because the mountain was there, but because I was there. I laughed to be alive. And what am I alive for, if not to laugh? I said to the mountain, I believe I have the right to address you, sir. Princes can speak to mountains, and poets are at least the equal of princes. Then I heard the mountain laughing, and I wondered, is this mountain laughing at me or with me? Suddenly I sensed that the trees were laughing too, and the streams and the grass and the rocks and the earth under my feet. We laughed, they and I, there upon the laughing mountain, rocking through space together, rolling with the laughter of being. So may you roll with the laughter of being. Thank you.